Negative gearing tax break costs are about to skyrocket. Soaring interest rates means Australian taxpayers could spend billions of dollars to offset private landlords' lost income over the coming years. This has the potential to cost the public purse up to $6 billion per year for what you might call a wealthy tax break, all the while renters are getting squeezed with ridiculous rent hikes, crazy demand for rentals, and ludicrously expensive housing, which means they can't afford to get out of this rental cycle crisis. I'm Vico Konstantinos, and it's a pleasure to have you. What is negative gearing, and why are the costs of this very lucrative tax break about to soar? A property is negatively geared when the cost of interest and expenses linked to owning a rental is more than the income it generates each year. In other words, if you own an investment property and all the expenses that you can claim is more than the income you receive from rent, then that means that the property is negatively geared, and this tax break that Australia has, which pretty much no other country has, means that landlords can claim the loss as a tax deduction against their own personal wages, which means they pay less tax on their personal wage income. So what's happened over the past few years is that variable interest rates have been reduced all the way to near zero, which means that people with investment properties did not have to pay much interest on the loans for those properties, which means that their expenses were actually quite low and there wasn't as many overall losses, which means there wasn't as much negatively geared tax breaks claimed by investors. So while property investors made around 40% capital gains during the post-COVID boom, they also had very low expenses due to the ultra low interest rates. But because interest rates have now been hiked aggressively, the number of negatively geared properties will increase dramatically, which means the cost of this tax break will increase, and that cost ends up being paid by all taxpayers because it affects the national budget, and because it affects the national budget, the cost of negative gearing is paid by all taxpayers. The real unfairness of negative gearing occurs because it is overwhelmingly used by the wealthy to reduce their tax. According to independent economist Saul Eslake, someone in the top tax bracket is more than 3 times as likely to be a negatively geared landlord as opposed to someone with a taxable income of less than $90,000. Negative gearing is primarily used by people in the top tax bracket to either get them out of that top tax bracket and onto a lower one, or to reduce the amount of tax on that top tax bracket. So if you're on a very high income, say above $200,000 or $250,000, then almost any financial expert in Australia would recommend you to buy a significant amount of property, not caring if you're making a loss, because that will actually help them to reduce their tax on their personal income. So the cost of negative gearing is going to skyrocket. That cost affects all taxpayers, but the tax break is predominantly used by the very wealthy. Something just doesn't add up. I'm not saying people shouldn't negatively gear. I would also recommend to anyone on a high income tax bracket to negatively gear a property, especially in Australia where the demand has been so strong for so long. But what I am saying is that negative gearing no longer serves Australia and just really needs to be demolished. So why does Australia continue to allow this very lucrative tax break called negative gearing when it overwhelmingly favours those on a very high income or those who already own property, and when it costs the taxpayers billions of dollars, which is going to really increase over the next several years? Now, before the Labor Party won this latest election in Australia, they previously tried twice to overhaul negative gearing, but because they didn't win those elections, it was never implemented. But personally, I think that's a big mistake. I think it's clear for all political parties in Australia that negative gearing just doesn't serve us as a country anymore. But the trouble with politics, when you've got 2/3 of Australians who own property, you don't want to be seen to do anything that might make property prices fall. But we have to get over this as a nation. Property prices have massively outgrown wages for over 30 years now. And when you look across the globe, it's those countries with the extra generous housing policies that seems to have the most expensive housing. And Australia is right up the top. Don't believe me? Check out this video here. It's no coincidence that our housing affordability is almost the worst in the entire developed world. Why? because we seem to give the most generous tax breaks to the most wealthy and to those who own the most property. And this just ends up creating massive demand for housing, which cause huge capital gains year after year, that we find ourselves in this current position where hardworking Australians who don't inherit property may never be able to afford their own home, and that's a tragedy. The Grattan Institute's 2022 Orange Book, which present their policy priorities for the federal government, recommend that housing tax policies be reformed in order to reduce overall demand. Specifically, they recommend to reduce the capital gains discount and abolish negative gearing. And based on their analysis, there wouldn't be any massive housing crash or any major effect to rent prices. So an effect of scrapping negative gearing is that would-be homeowners would win at the expense of investors. And isn't that what we want? A chance for more Australians to be able to buy their own home, so they're no longer at the mercy of rental leases, at the risk of being kicked out in short notice, or like we've seen recently, at the risk of having their rent jump up to ridiculous levels with no real say about it. Personally, I'd love it if more Australians had this opportunity to own their own home. That's the Australia we used to have 30 years ago, and that's the Australia I'd love to see again. This was the land of opportunity, but because of inaction on housing affordability, we've inadvertently created a two-class system, and a very large wealth gap is starting to occur. Let's make some changes, Australia. We're not talking about penalising investors. There'll always be great money to be made by great investments. However, housing should not be a sure bet like it is today. We shouldn't create so much speculative demand that amazing capital growth is almost guaranteed.
Guaranteed.
Grattan Institute's Economic Policy Program Director Brendan Coates said it was inevitable that negative gearing costs to the budget would increase. It will cost the federal government substantially as interest rates rise. And as we know, they've gone up very fast over the last few months, with further hikes expected. Coates said one less renter is one more first home buyer, which is a policy objective in its own right. And I 100% agree. I see many comments from people saying that if you scrap negative gearing, there won't be enough properties for rent. But I don't believe that, because most countries in the world don't have negative gearing and they have rental properties. And if housing does become more affordable, it will mean that more and more renters will be able to afford their own home, which was the situation we had 30 years ago, where the proportion of homeowners was a lot higher than it is today. So as a taxpayer, are you happy to keep footing the bill for this very generous tax perk called negative gearing? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your thoughts and get to know you. Hey, if you enjoy this content, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to my channel. My goal is to provide you with valuable and entertaining content. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and I'll catch you in my next video.